Well, thank you all for coming so early in the morning. This is a session about history, and I'm going to start with talking about India. The title of the paper is Community Origins of Industrial Entrepreneurship in Pre-Independence India, and this is joint work with Dilip Mukherjee in Boston University, Kaivan Munshi in Cambridge, and Mario Saclemente, who was at Warwick but now is back in Chile. So why do we care? Why do we want to think about Indian industrialization? The early industrialization literature basically thinks about prerequisites of industrialization. So for example, the Industrial Revolution in Britain, that in Germany, or the United States. Work by Joel Mokyr, Douglas North, and Weingast focus on the role of property rights that allowed technological development and therefore industrialization quite independent of the state. The later industrializers, such as the United States and Germany, used the state more as a vehicle of industrialization. So for example, tariffs in the United States, the state as an entrepreneur in Russia, the developmental states in East Asia. So our question was that what happens when the institutional setting is missing and the state doesn't really play a supportive role? The context is pre-independence colonial India, when the state was much more interested in exporting British industrial goods to India rather than developing local industries. In fact, Lancashire tried actively to stifle any type of industrialization. But nevertheless, from the middle of the 19th century, a pretty large cotton textile sector developed. So our question is, how did this happen? So one possible channel we can think of is the role of community networks. The role of community networks is widely discussed in the context of trade. For example, the work by Avner Greif. It's also discussed in the context of development economics, role of community networks in credit and insurance, in labor markets, and so on. Our context is quite different. It's the context of industrialization. And the way we want to think of the role of communities is the way in which they exchange information, exchange know-how, share information, and then overcome problems of contractual moral hazard. So in this paper, what we are going to do is look at two different industries. The cotton textile industry in the late 19th century and the jute textile industry in just after the First World War. We create a completely new data set of entrepreneurs who were present in these two industries right from 1850. And we are going to use the American Civil War as a natural experiment to look at the role of entrance at this period on the following development of the industries in the two sectors. So one is going to use the American Civil War as a natural experiment, and for jute, we are going to use the context of the First World War. We have a simple model in the paper, which I'm not going to talk about now, given the constraint of time. And we are going to analyze the entry of entrepreneurs over time, controlling for community fixed effects and year fixed effects. So think of what alternative explanations might be there. There are several out there in the literature. One is the work by John Sutton, where he looks at development of skills in an upstream industry which allows entry into the downstream. Then there's work by Karl Marx, and then also the same idea is present in the work of Banerjee and Newman, where wealth accumulation in pre-industrial activity is important for industrialization. In our explanation, what is going to matter is the spillovers within the communities. It's not going to be wealth or skill necessarily. It's going to be these spillovers which are generated within the communities. The empirical strategy is really simple. What we are going to look at is the downstream of the cotton textile industry. And we are going to have an initial stock of entrepreneurs during the Civil War. And then we are going to estimate the network effect in terms of the endogenously evolving network effects with reference to this initial stock. And then we are going to control for community fixed effects and near fixed effects. A summary of the findings is as follows, in case I don't get to the end. There is no direct evidence that pre-industrial wealth accumulation or skill formation actually mattered, but there is very robust evidence of a network effect. So one additional entrepreneur in the initial stock generated 4.4 additional entrepreneurs in 1890. And this concentration of communities at the level of the firm continued even when we go all the way up to 1930. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little bit of a background on Indian industrialization. So this is a kind of, a typical case of global, a completely free global economy, which was colonial, and therefore had access to the British capital market and other markets internationally. The British investment that flowed into India was in very specific sectors. It was in railways, infrastructure, it was in tea, and it was in jute as well. So these are the sectors where British investment dominated. When we look at the major input substituting industry, which is the cotton textile industry, which is a very large sector, it is almost entirely Indian capital. I mean, that doesn't mean British capital wasn't present, but it's really quite small. And these two, the industrial centers in India were in two different spaces. On the western side, near Bombay, is the place where the cotton textile industry developed. And then we moved to the east, near Calcutta, which is where the jute industry developed. And these two regions are very much separated in terms of ownership. Western India was dominated by Indian capital and Eastern India by British capital. That's the kind of share of different sectors in investment. I'm going to just go through it quite quickly. So how did the cotton textile industry begin to grow? It started to emerge as an indigenous industry, quite separate from the traditional weaving industry, which was there for many centuries. It started from 1850, first in Bombay, and then it spread to Ahmedabad, which is a city close to Bombay. And the two cities were located in the region of the Bombay Presidency. There were two segments of this industry. One is upstream, and the upstream was essentially buying raw cotton from the producers, baling them into forms which can be then shipped to the UK or used in the domestic market. And the downstream is when this raw cotton was woven into thread, was spun into thread, and then woven into cloth. So the two sectors are quite different, and we are going to study them separately and focus on the downstream today because it is a sector which required more capital and was much more complex. We are going to focus on mainly on Bombay in this presentation. So how did the industry actually develop during the Civil War? From 1850, one or two entrepreneurs from the trading communities in Bombay were present in this sector. When the US Civil War started, the exports of raw cotton from the US to Britain were stopped. So the entire supply source shifted to India, and there was a big increase in baling activity in this period, leading to the emergence of the upstream sector. When the Civil War ended, the source of supply shifted back to the US, and this fall in the profitability of the upstream sector led to a big increase in entry into the downstream. This happened despite the absence of capital markets. This happened despite any kind of state intervention by providing supportive tariffs. So that's a picture you can see. This is the downstream. You can see the entry during the Civil War and the flattening out after that. These are stocks of firms. And this is the downstream where there are some firms in the Civil War. This number is really small. And then that increasing very rapidly in the following years. This is what the two sectors look like, and that's why we want to focus on the downstream. This is the upstream where you can see raw cotton, which is then being processed into bales, and this sector looks pretty, simple, right? Doesn't require any fancy technology. And this is the first downstream mill that was set up in Bombay in 1854, a much more complicated industry requiring imported capital goods from Britain. So we can think in terms of the role of the community in the following ways. One is we can think of the community as a source of capital. In India, the banks did not provide, there were some banks in Bombay and Calcutta and elsewhere, they did not provide any long-term capital. They provided some short-term capital. There was no formal stock market up to 1875. Even when the stock market was set up, most of the firms borrowed from the community members. So they would sell their shares to members of the community, and there's enough anecdotal evidence on that. And so the capital market remained highly segmented despite the presence of a stock exchange. We can also think of the community as a source of contract enforcement. So again, the institutions were pretty weak in India. There was no civil code for contract enforcement. Everything was a criminal offense. So until 1872, even when the legislation was passed, the firms continued to rely on their communities to enforce contractual obligations. This was also a period of free trade within the British Empire. So trade was free from India to Britain due to some kind of revenue purposes. A tariff rate of 3 to 5% was imposed on cotton textiles. Lancashire lobbied to get countervailing excise of the same rate. So the net tariff on Indian industries at this point was actually 0. And this continued to be the case right up to 1950s. There were some prominent communities here. There were 5 different trading communities coming from different caste and religious backgrounds. The first were the Parsis, a very special entrepreneurial group who migrated from Persia to India in the 8th century. The Bhatiyas, a Hindu community, a very small Hindu community which was quite progressive in terms of social values. The Khoja Muslims, again a small sector a sect within the Muslim community. The Baghdadi Jews, the Europeans, and then 2 Hindu groups, the Jains and the Vanyas. And we treat them as one group because not just that they were very similar in terms of their involvement in the economic sectors, but they also intermarried. So we are going to treat them as one community. All these communities were involved in some kind of pre-industrial activity. Either it was cotton trade, or it was money lending, or it was interaction as agents or brokers of the East India Company. So their outside options were different, which may have influenced their time of entry into the cotton textile industry. So when we look at the entry at the entrepreneur level, these are stocks of entrepreneurs. You can see this is the stock of entrepreneurs in the Civil War rising over time. And now when we break it down by community, you can see one community emerges as the biggest group in a pretty nonlinear fashion, and that's the Parsis. There are other groups too, but you can see the pattern of entry is pretty nonlinear over time. So the main assumption in identifying the network effect is going to be as follows. We are going to assume that the community characteristics do not vary in a nonlinear way, and they do not vary across communities. The levels may be different. So that's the main assumption of the paper, and I'm going to show you some supportive evidence or suggestive evidence that this is indeed the case. So the network effect is going to depend on this nonlinear increase in the stock, community stock, given the initial stock of entrepreneurs. So here's some evidence on how literacy varied across communities, and you can see that the Parsis were by far the most literate of all the groups. They don't change over time in different ways. So there is a community-specific trend, but that's not good. The nonlinearity is not going to come from education or population. So these are the population of the different communities in Bombay City. So let me say a little bit about the data. How much time do I have? 10 minutes? Okay. So the data comes from business registers and almanacs, and it's available from 1840 by sector, and it's from the 3 cities, Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras. We extract at the firm level, we extract the names of every entrepreneur in a firm who are either directors or partners in a firm. Each of these entrepreneurs are then assigned a community from their names, and the firms are also classified by community depending on majority of the directors. And we have annual data from 1860 to 1910, and then we have 5-yearly data all the way up to 1955. So this is what the data looks like. You can see this is a Parsi firm. This guy is clearly a Parsi. This guy is a Parsi. This guy is a Parsi. This guy is a Parsi. So this is clearly a Parsi firm. And we classify the firm as a Parsi firm as well. Okay, so 2 things I'm going to talk about in terms of descriptive statistics. One is going to be, did past experience matter? And the idea is that, was presence in a upstream activity required for entry into the downstream? And this is what you find, that the light part of the bar is people who had no upstream experience. And you can see that's the majority of the entrepreneurs. So it's not necessary that you required some kind of upstream experience to enter as an entrepreneur into the cotton textile industry. The second thing I'm going to show you now is the matching at entry. That is, when an entrepreneur entered, did this entrepreneur go to a firm of the same community or to a firm of a different community? And here, again, you'll see very high concentration. This is different communities, so about under 40% of the entrepreneurs went to a firm of a different communities, and that proportion by 90 is even smaller. So the largest overwhelming number of entrepreneurs went to a firm that belonged to the same community. This is the equation that we estimate. So this is the stock of entrepreneurs at time t. Depends on the initial stock interacted with the time trend square. And then there are community-specific fixed effects, time effects, and so on. The initial stock has variation. You can see the initial stock in upstream and the initial stock in downstream. There's kind of quite a lot of variation by community. Now, if you look at the estimates that we have, the interaction term is strongly significant. So the higher the number of members of a community in the initial stock, the larger is the number over time. And this is robust to different specification. As we change the dummies and control for different community-specific effects, we still find the effect to be pretty robust. Now what we do is we extend the period to 1890. From 1890 to 1910, here something actually changes quite dramatically. Most of the entry after 1890 actually happens in the city of Ahmedabad, which is several hundred miles away from Bombay. And here, what is different as well, the communities which become important are not the same ones who are present in Bombay. So the main communities, Ahmedabad, are different communities. These are the Vanya communities and the Jains. And the reason they enter at this point, we think, is that money lending regulations come in the 1870s, which make money lending more risky compared to before. So we see a big entry of these money lenders into the cotton textile industry. They also become the largest group. So this is the green line. You see them in 1870, 1880, 1890. They're pretty small, and then suddenly they enter in a major way. Okay, thanks. I'm going to break it down between the two cities. This is Bombay. You see, this is the main entry point. And the Parsis kind of stabilize after that. You can think in terms of the number of possible entrepreneurs are limited. In the paper, we kind of assume population doesn't matter, but this may not be the case. And this is Ahmedabad, where you see everything is quite flat, and then there is a sudden increase in entry, and this is from a different community. So can we then estimate the same thing for Ahmedabad as well for the later period? And the answer to that is no, because the initial stock of the Civil War is no longer the relevant initial stock, because the community that has come in is different. It's a new location, the groups are new. So what we are going to do is we are just going to show you some descriptive statistics to show that the same pattern actually still continues. And this is people entering with upstream experience. Again, you can see that number is pretty small. It's really small by 1910. If you look at when they enter, do they go to a firm of the same community or not? You can see that, you can see that this actually, the number of same community matching is really big in Ahmedabad, and it increases over time. So we still observe very community-specific effects within firms, even when we extend the period. So these are the summary of results. There's not much evidence of a prior experience in entry. There is a pretty solid experience of matching in firms by community, and there's robust evidence of network effect on, it's kind of a multiplier on the incumbent stocks. So one entrepreneur, additional entrepreneur during the Civil War had led to 4.4 more entrepreneurs in 1890. Okay, do I have time, 2-3 minutes? Okay, so I'm just going to show you the jute industry and what happened there. And it's a very different industry, because this was a British-dominated industry. There were literally a handful of Indian entrepreneurs in different British firms. But during the First World War, the British firm began to borrow from the Marwari traders. So there were many Indians who became shareholders in British firms and gradually became directors in this firm. So there was an increase in entrepreneurship from the Indian communities during the First World War. And basically there were two communities present. These were again different communities, the Bengalis and the Marwaris in the upstream. It's only the Marwaris who entered the downstream. And again, if you see the pattern, you can see there's an increase, there's a stock, there's an increase. Splitting up by community, it's the Marwaris which increase significantly over time. And then we do the same thing in estimating the network effect, and I'll show you this is what our key variable is, initial stock minus multiplied by time to n square. Again, this is a variable which is positive and significant. So even in jute, which is a very different industry, we find very strong effects of the network, even when the ownership kind of passes from British to Indian entrepreneurs. And here is some evidence of community matching. You can see that matching is less strong in the jute industry compared to cotton, and that because the way of entry was different. It was through buying shares rather than setting up new firms. Some new firms were set up, but those were fewer. And if you extend the time, you can see that there are lots of the strength of the concentration is much lower. So in conclusion, we think that community networks were important in early industrialization in India, when the institutions were not present to create the right incentives and the state did not play a supporting role. There were different communities in jute and cotton textile industries in the downstream in different locations. We don't find evidence of the upstream experience playing a big role, but we do find significant evidence of robust network effect in both these industries. And we think this is some kind of spillovers through communication and information sharing through the network in this period. Thank you. Yeah.
I saw that the manager was not from the same community. It looked like the manager was European. So could it be that, this sort of matching was possible because they were getting the know-how in the form of managers from a different community, possibly European? I mean, is that something that you also took into consideration? Was there skill coming in from a different
No, that's a good point. I mean, we know who the managers were. We don't include them in the category of entrepreneurs. So in this firm, the manager is British, but in many Parsi firms, the managers are not British because the Parsis were quite literate. But your point is particularly valid for firms such as Vanya firms, or where the literacy level was not that high and experience was not that high. There the managers were often either British or Parsi, and it's something we haven't really looked at, but we can think of looking at that. Thank you. Yeah.
Should we think of previous upstream experience as a measure of quality of the entrepreneur? Because we see that share decreases over time where the community, within the community, hierarchy increases, so it's the kind of strength of the community in some sense, allowing less skilled entrepreneurs to enter. Is that what we see?
No, absolutely. So we can think of pioneers who are coming from the upstream, and they are there in the initial stock, right? But then over time, people who they draw in are not those who have any experience. They clearly have wealth. We don't know where that wealth comes from because we tried to link them to all kinds of trading names we have, but we couldn't find much evidence. So that we think is a pure network effect, that they come in because somebody in the community tells them this is a profitable enterprise, so come in.